Call because you already know this. Viral misinformation is contagious and it is dangerous. Just like an actual virus, this content spreads because people are sharing it with each other, and it creates significant problems. Problems that put our health and well-being at risk, as well as the future of our democracy. So I want to talk a little bit about what we are specifically referring to when we talk about problematic content. These are a couple of different areas. You'll note false and fabricated information isn't listed here because that's sort of the baseline. That's obvious, right? But beyond that, we're talking about content that uses fear and manipulation, right? Content that tries to make you feel scared, angry, or self-righteous to get you to change your behavior. That's potentially risky content that might have a problem and might have underlying misinformation embedded in it in some way or another. We're certainly interested in conspiracy theories, even when you're postulating about something, not saying it's definitively the case, but hypothesizing, that may in fact still be problematic. Lots of pseudoscience has been floating around, especially during the pandemic, but has existed for a long time. Climate change denial is a perfect example of that. And anything that employs hate outright or dog whistles. The kinds of terms or themes that divide based on identity are sort of rooted in a kind of misinformation and breed and perpetuate other kinds of problematic content. The big overarching idea that I want to make sure everyone recognizes is this point at the bottom. It doesn't have to be false to be a problem, right? False is the easy stuff. All the rest of this stuff is a lot harder. It requires more vigilance, but can be just as, if not more, problematic. The most concerning theme that I see cropping up around the election is about an impending civil war. This is a growing theme that is appearing on both sides of the political spectrum and is at this point starting to grow into almost a fait accompli. Like, it is going to happen. Whatever the outcome of the upcoming election, there is likely to be violence. And I'm not arguing that there is likely to be, but that the messages on social media are arguing that there is likely to be. And that is sort of seeding the ground for actual potential violence. But at the moment, there is no reason to believe that there will be violence. And so all of the conversation and messaging around it is problematic because it's amplifying the potential risk for violence that we clearly do not need. It's about voting access. This is one that is persistent. This is not the first election where we're seeing this, but messages about voting itself. So when can you or can't you register for a mail-in ballot or absentee ballot, when, where, and how you can vote. Both intentional and unintentional versions of this. The classic example is saying Republicans can vote on Wednesdays, or vice versa. You know, Republicans vote on Tuesdays, Democrats vote on Wednesdays. Obviously, everyone votes on election day or before, so it's hard to narrow down exactly what the right or wrong way is to talk about that, but there is a lot of mis and disinformation around voting access. There is even more mis and disinformation around ballot risks. I think the classic thing that we've seen, and I'll show some examples of it, are ballots being thrown out. Now that we have this massive volume of vote by mail and absentee voting, and a lot of rhetoric about fraud related to absentee voting and vote by mail, we're seeing a lot of mis and disinformation around it. Almost every day, there is a new image circulating on social media of a pile of ballots somewhere, right? And lots of questions being raised about it. There are also more complex questions about voter fraud and concepts like ballot harvesting. Ballot harvesting is essentially a code word or almost a dog whistle for sometimes potentially legitimate activity or the false implication of fraud. But ballot harvesting has now become a part of the lexicon, and whenever you see it, you can almost always recognize that there's some risk in problematic content that references it. And then finally, this big, broad, unfounded fear mongering. So allegations about stealing or rigging the election, right? It's connected to a bunch of those other themes, but in and of itself is its own theme. And so we see quite a lot of that. And that message is sort of part of the drip, drip, drip of problematic content that people are experiencing on a daily basis that is undermining their faith in democracy, undermining their faith in our institutions, and sort of laying the groundwork for chaos come November 4th.
Absentee ballots, early voting and voting in person, but especially mail-in ballots. There's a couple states right now, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, to name a few, that are contentious, that have an alarming number of African-American votes that are being rejected, right? Almost twice the time as other races, right? So this is really going on right now. And a big part of that is people not understanding exactly what to do with the envelope. Witness signatures are necessary in North Carolina in order to process a ballot. Signatures have to match pretty much exactly, or ballots can all be thrown out, essentially. There's something in North Carolina going on right now called pending cure, and pending cure means you could possibly fix that ballot. Now, a measure just was passed, I think on Wednesday, that essentially said that the ballots that maybe had non-matched signatures could pend cure, but anything with a witness signature that didn't line up, basically the ballot will be thrown out and you would have to revote and you would have to wait for a decision. So some of these decisions might not even come until the day before the election, a couple days before the election. This is just plain all and out voter suppression and confusing, because if you resubmit a vote, there's always the danger that you voted twice, which is a felony. And the president has been pushing the idea that, voting twice is voter fraud is something that's really happening right now, when we know that it's not. Voter fraud is extremely rare. But this kind of all started, I'd say, a couple of months ago, end of August. You could see that there was just pandemonium and confusion about the mailing system. The Postmaster General, DeJoy, kind of defunded a lot of aspects of the post office. And so there were pictures going around. This is one from, I believe, Southern California, that's saying that these are locking mailboxes, right? This mailbox actually has been locked for years. It's not locked in the front, it's only locked from this side. And that was because there was legitimate mail phishing happening at this location, right? But there's a video of this, and on the other side, you can see that this mailbox wasn't locked, right? I'm sure that you saw during this time period pictures of mailboxes looking like they were being picked up and thrown away, or in junkyards. All of this sort of information started to proliferate around the same time. Very anxiety inducing, very confusing to the voter, right? To the right, we have like a how to vote by mail thing. Now, the problem with things like this is voting by mail differs per state. Everyone has different rules per state. So while I believe that this is more misinformation rather than disinformation, this is still can depress or suppress the vote, because this information here does not apply to all states, but it did get a severe amount of traction on Twitter, thousands of reshares. So just like Cameron was saying, we have the official RNC who had the fake drop boxes in California, who also, even though they've been have refused to take these drop boxes down. So like Cameron said, like, it will cause a lot of confusion. But here's another element of confusion: posting an official ballot drop box as the lead for your reporting, right? This should not be the picture that's the lead, right? Because this now confuses people. Now you have in your mind, oh my goodness, this is an official ballot box. If you look at one, you might say, oh, this is the picture I saw with the article that basically said that, unofficial ballot boxes are around California. So this isn't something that one should do. Should either use false labeling over top of it, choose a picture of the actual fake Dropbox. There's other things you could do, because now these real images of drop boxes start to proliferate across Twitter and across social media, confusing voters, causing voter suppression. And, some reporters believe this is actually a time-lapse video of the long lines in North Carolina. And the quote says, "I've lost count of the amount of voters who told me they wanted to vote in person because they were nervous about mail-in voting," right? So if you're reading these things, you're a Black American, and you're seeing that 2/3 of your votes are being rejected, and confusion about what's going on and confusion about how to submit, then you're risking your health. Long lines are happening. Long lines are more likely in Black communities in the first place. I think you're 7 times more likely to wait in the line that's over an hour, I believe. So these are all forms of voter suppression and depression that we look out for at First Draft. And so this is something that we found earlier in the week. And the quote says, "A beautiful mosaic of Kamala Harris made out of all the Black men she locked up and kept in prison past their release date for jail labor. Never forget." So the record of Kamala Harris is used often because of her time as a prosecutor, some of the contentious decisions she may have made, also running with Joe Biden, things with the crime bill. So really, like, the grain of truth within kind of their past gets over amplified, and misinformation. You can see here that there's some images. They've been repeated. This is not, these images have not been identified. It's about 6 that just continue to be repeated in this mosaic, but this image got unbelievable shares, as you can see to the bottom right, over 14,000 shares, right? On that day, between the 8th and 9th, over 150 pages were sharing this mosaic. It was cross-post on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, every platform you could imagine, extremely popular, but gives the idea that somehow Kamala Harris might be in support of putting Black men in jail, locking Black men away, which is a clear disinformation tactic.
I think there's like 5 key dynamics when it comes to disinformation within Latinx communities, but also other communities of color. And one is that there are diverse cultural nuances and demographics within the Latino community and other communities of color, especially geographic and generational, which creates opportunities for false information. And then number 2, which is why you all are also extremely important, is that there are data and robust information voids in Latinx news, especially Spanish language, that are exploited and easily filled by false or deceptive narratives from bad actors. And we often see that Spanish language voters tend to follow political news less closely, so they're more susceptible to these kind of tactics. And then 3, there are also false narratives that are co-opted and rapidly amplified in Spanish, which often goes largely unchecked on social media. There's also external foreign interference, like Russia, that has exploited hot button issues such as, immigration, but there's also a lot of domestic actors pushing out disinformation and misinformation. And finally, messaging platforms such as WhatsApp, we know is very popular among the Latino community and also other communities of color. It's central to the spread of information and disinformation, which is an issue because, these closed platforms are much harder to know what's going on. So those are just some kind of key dynamics that I think are important to understand how this all works, but I'll just move on to some of the narratives we're seeing. I think the main top line here that I really want to get out there is that bad actors are using social media for the offline goal of suppressing the vote and depressing enthusiasm among key progressive constituencies, including the Latino community. And we often see bad actors trying to inflame pre-existing tensions within and between communities. For example, Jacqueline mentioned Black Lives Matter. We saw a lot of bad actors looking for opportunities to create divisions among communities of color. So we especially saw this from far-right actors, including far-right Latinx actors who, try to attempt to position the Latino and Black communities against each other. But we also see them, trying to divide within the Latino community. So I'm going to talk about some of the key narratives that are prevalent in Latinx spaces, such as protest violence and racial tension, this idea of this perceived threat of socialism, and vote by mail attacks. But really quickly, before I go into the narratives, I do want to mention that we're seeing some far-right Latinx accounts coordinating their efforts, which is a common tactic by bad actors, where they often share the same story or meme with the same post at the same time across their Facebook pages, which allows them to reach more feeds and people. And these posts here are promoting stories of alleged voter fraud and trying to discredit vote by mail efforts, which I'll discuss later. But this coordinated messaging around mail-in voting fraud is already being directed to the Hispanic community. And while there's legitimate confusion, there's a clear intention to create distrust of both political parties and of the system in general in order to depress voter turnout. And then I want to go a little bit more into detail about the narratives around violence and crime. So we're seeing bad actors trying to create racial tension and division among these communities of color, and we continue to see this narrative being pushed in Latinx spaces around the protest violence. So we not only see bad actors attack Black Lives Matter more broadly, but we often see them, tap into racist tropes or white supremacist narratives. So you see from these screenshots here, many, these are all Latinx accounts, some of them Spanish accounts, where they, activated around the murder of a young white kid and specifically promote, race blindness by pointing out that a Black man was a suspect, as you can see from the second and third post. But they use this story to, criticize Black Lives Matter in the media for essentially not protesting the death of the child and for staying silent, which is something that we've seen throughout this year, especially in Latinx spaces. We saw it around the death of Vanessa Guillen, where users were criticizing Black Lives Matter for staying silent and would claim that they didn't care about Latinos or they don't care about anybody outside of the Black community. And this is just another example. The post on the right, it's a narrative that Black Lives Matter is silent on Black crime, and then they use that to claim that the real issue is black on Black crime over police brutality and systemic racism. that we continue to see far-right and pro-Trump actors amplifying this threat of socialism and this idea that socialism is coming to America. And we see this same message being amplified in Latinx spaces, and they often tailor it to their audiences by attacking, socialist Latin American countries such as Cuba and Venezuela. So we saw a lot of people amplifying, certain speeches during the RNC convention of Latinx speakers, and then, far-right Latinx accounts following them and publishing narratives about this perceived threat of socialism. And then within this narrative, we continue to see a lot of pro-Trump Latinx influencers continue to claim that the left is supportive of these socialist policies and are looking to spread in the United States. As you can see here, the first post connects Biden specifically to socialism. And then the second post also claims that his supporters are like harassing the right, and that these actions are similar to Castro's Cuba, which is a narrative we've seen where they compare, these type of confrontations or the BLM protests to actions in Latin American socialist countries, and then claim that the left is responsible for this, and then use that to promote the narrative that they want socialism. But as you can see, they're also promoting the narrative of Biden, being, quote, the Trojan horse of socialism. And then the post on the right was from another Spanish language account with a big following in Florida, essentially saying that you have to vote for Trump to save the US from socialism. I think overall the socialism narrative and painting the left as, radical and extreme is a narrative that we'll continue to see in far-right Latinx spaces online up to the election and after. But I think it's just another example of bad actors trying to feed into real fears and suspicions that they think Latino voters, including Spanish language voters and recent immigrants, might have.